This is Bernard. Do you hear me?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well. Thank you. Can you see us?
I can see you. Sorry for being a little late. I had computer problems, but they finally.
No worries. That's what technology.
Yeah.
If you're ready, we can get started. Are you ready? Is it okay to get started? No?
Okay with me?
Okay. All right. Welcome back. Welcome to Utopia 1313 and Happy New Year. This is the first session of the spring, and a very special session where we welcome Professor Noam Chomsky and my colleague extraordinaire, Jay Gossett. Our problematic at this seminar is to identify and discuss what we have been calling concrete utopias, with the idea that the best way to ignite social transformation is to highlight the fact that it is possible and that it is happening all around us. Whether it is Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, or the Longomai and Terra Eco Cooperatives in southern France, or the US Federation of Worker Cooperatives, the Freelancers Union, or Starbucks unionization right here in New York City, or the Columbia Student Workers Union right here at Columbia. And we've had representatives from all of those organizing spaces here at Utopia 1313. The point is that concrete change is possible, is here, and can help guide us towards more social change. Now, as part of that discussion, we've also taken some theoretical steps back to think about the place of concrete utopian thinking and practice in social transformation. So we've had, for instance, the French philosopher Etienne Balibar to focus on the critical theoretic foundations of concrete utopias. And today, with Professor Noam Chomsky and Jay Gossett, we hope to once again theoretically and practically work through some ideas about utopia and concrete utopias. As you all know, as evidenced from this overcrowded space, which hopefully we won't be violating too many fire laws, Professor Noam Chomsky is and has been for years now a role model for critical thinkers and practitioners. An engaged intellectual, Chomsky unfailingly speaks truth to power in the great and long tradition of the parrhesiasts. As I wrote in my introduction, I was thinking of Professor Chomsky as a modern day Voltaire or Rousseau or Wollstonecraft. In his humility and his brutal honesty, I often think of Chomsky as one of the greatest parrhesiasts, along with the philosopher Diogenes of Sinope. So it was with utter delight when my colleague extraordinaire, Chair Jay Gossett, organized to have Noam Chomsky join us this evening. Thank you, Jay. We'll proceed in the following fashion. I'll introduce Jay. Jay will introduce Noam Chomsky. After Noam will have a chance to present his thoughts on the question of concrete utopias, then Jay and I will co-facilitate a discussion and moderate a question and answer session. As I mentioned twice now, Jay Gossett is my colleague extraordinaire here at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought at Columbia University. The Racial Justice Postdoctoral Fellow at our Initiative for a Just Society, Jay is a writer and critical theorist specializing in queer trans studies, aesthetic theory, abolitionist thought, Black study, and critical animal studies. Jay is also currently a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School's Animal Law and Policy program. Jay is a prolific writer and researcher. They've published extensively, including in numerous anthologies such as Trapdoor, Transcultural Production and the Politics of Visibility, out in 2018, Death and Other Penalties, Continental Philosophers on Prisons and Capital Punishment, from Fordham University Press, and the Transgender Studies Reader, Routledge Press. And they also received the 2022 Art Journal Award, along with co-author Professor David Getze, for their syllabus on trans art history. Che is currently working on 2 book projects, both with Duke University Press. The first is related to, it's a revision of their dissertation on the politics and aesthetics of abolition. And the second is a political biography of queer AIDS activist Kiyoshi Kuromiya, who in many ways instantiated many of the values that Noam Chomsky has defended over the years. Che and my hope for this session would be able to address the larger theoretical issues surrounding concrete utopias and also focus on at least 3, now 4 texts of Professor Chomsky, the famous 1967 essay, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, the famous Chomsky-Foucault debate from 1971, Professor Chomsky's book on anarchism, and also the Dewey lectures on what kind of creatures we are. So I'm totally thrilled to turn it over to my colleague, Jay Gossett, who will introduce Professor Noam Chomsky and then facilitate the discussion. Welcome to Utopia 613.
Thanks so much, Bernard, for that kind introduction. Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky, for being here with us. I'm just gonna introduce you, which is like quite a honor and a responsibility. So, and then I'll say the prompt as well that you'll speak about, and then I'll hand it over to you. So Professor Noam Chomsky is currently the Laureate Professor of Linguistics at the University of Arizona and Institute Professor and Professor of Linguistics Emeritus at MIT. His path-breaking contributions to the field of linguistics, such as syntactic structures, Cartesian linguistics, the minimalist program, and other texts, many other texts, are indispensable for the study of language and understanding its role for humans as a biolinguistic species. His recent books, What Kind of Creatures Are We and Why Only Us? Language and Evolution, co-authored with Robert C. Berwick, who is professor of computational linguistics at MIT, explores the origins and development of human language in a writing style that, as always, engages a multitude of publics in its ambit. Professor Chomsky's almost too numerous to name contributions to political theory, media studies, and activist knowledges include, but aren't limited to, of course, his book, The Fateful Triangle, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of Mass Media, which was co-authored with the late Edward S. Herman, who for many, many years was a professor of finance and communication at University of Pennsylvania. Also Failed States, The Abuse of Power and the Attack on Democracy. He's also done, participated in lectures, lively debates, perhaps the most well-known being with the French philosopher Michel Foucault. In 1971, Professor Chomsky is the recipient of the Kyoto Prize, the Benjamin Franklin Medal in Computer and Cognitive Science, the Sydney Peace Prize, and many other awards. He is as generous in spirit as he is prolific, devoting incredible amounts of time to cultivating social justice pedagogy across the globe. We're so looking forward, Professor Chomsky, to your remarks on and political analysis of the question of concrete utopias and what steps we might take or you might envision to enacting those aspirations of the here and now. So for Professor Chomsky's talk, we reread and revisited his 2017 preface to Michael Albert's book, Practical Utopia, Strategies for a Desirable Society. The preface ends with the following quote: "It is to these critical questions that Practical Utopia is dedicated. Few have thought as long and hard about these matters as Michael Albert, along with constructive efforts to planting the seeds of the future in the present." Quote. What he presents here is a distillation of a life searching thought and dedicated activism that merits great respect and close attention. So we asked Professor Chomsky to share his views on how we might plant the seeds of the future in our present, and we're so excited to hear your thoughts. So the floor is yours, Professor Chomsky.
Thank you. Well, the concept of planting the features of the future in the present society goes back to the leading anarchist theoretician and activist in the 19th century. Bakunin he was a utopian socialist, but said we don't have to wait. We can start right now. We can start planting the seeds of the future right in the present society, and that's what should be doing. This takes a sort of a middle position on a spectrum of plans for the future for a post-capitalist society. We can think of the ends of the spectrum as being, on one hand, Karl Marx, who had almost nothing to say about it. If you read through his works, there are a few scattered sentences about what a post-capitalist society might be. His reasoning was that when the fetters, when working people are freed from the fetters of capitalism, they will be able to think through, work together, deliberate, address the problems of developing a new society and doing it in the way that they will develop and work out. That's one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, you have anarchist theorists like Abad de Santillán, Spanish anarchist, 1930s, writing at the period of the greatest achievements of kind of practical utopia in the anarchist revolution of 1936, which was, I should say, just personally extremely significant in my own life. I learned about it not far from where you are. 42nd Street used to be it's not what it is now, but it used to be a center of radical offices and activism, including the Freie Arbeiterstimme, which had many works of anarchist thinking and activism. And down 4th Avenue were secondhand bookstores, many of them run by emigres, including Spanish anarchist emigres, and hanging around them and talking to people and picking up materials and pamphlets. I learned quite a lot, which wasn't known at the time, is only beginning to be understood now. But de Santillán tried to give a detailed, specific outline of what an anarchist society would be. That's the other end of the spectrum. Mike Albert, whose book was just mentioned and discussed, and I hope you'll have a chance to look at, is towards the de Santillán end of the spectrum. He and his colleagues like Robin Hannell, Stephen Shalom, have worked out in extensive detail ideas about what a post-capitalist society might look like. On the other hand, as the title of his book indicates, he's also interested in practical developments of steps towards a post-capitalist cooperative participatory society of the kind that they spell out in detail. My own position, for what it's worth, is somewhere in the middle. I'm skeptical about whether we know and understand enough about human beings or human society to say anything very definite about what would work successfully. And I think a good deal of experimentation would be necessary when conditions of freedom are sufficiently established so that these problems can be properly considered. Now, to some extent, can be done right away, and it is being done. There are very striking examples. I should say that one of the theoreticians who an activist who was prominent in developing these ideas was Columbia University professor Seymour Melman, personal friends for many years, who worked on, did very interesting work on working class takeover of enterprises and industries, and studied them in some detail. There was a variety of them, and argued for their feasibility and desirability in to construct a better world along participatory democratic lines. And there are significant examples, some of which have been partially inspired by his work, like the ones that were mentioned before in the old Rust Belt. To review the basic facts, when the neoliberal globalization projects were instituted, Reagan, particularly Clinton, designed to undermine domestic labor and to strengthen the power of international capital. One of the effects was deindustrialization of what's now called the Rust Belt. Similar things in other parts of the developed world. The Youngstown steel mills were closed by the ownership, basically financial institutions in New York, who decided they could recognize that they could make more profit by shifting production to northern Mexico, later other places, China, other places where workers are far more effectively exploited, much lower wages, no working conditions, no environmental conditions, and so on. End result, the industrialization in Indiana, Chicago, Cleveland, and so on. Well, there was an attempt to counter that. The steel workers offered. That would, of course, meant not just destruction of the working class itself, but also of the community. Communities were built around these mills. They fought back. They proposed to buy the steel mills from the owners and run them themselves. This was led by, the process was led by, mostly by Stoughton Lind, activist, civil rights, anti-war activist, kicked out of his academic jobs and went into the legal profession, became an advocate of labor rights and labor activism. He and others, Garo Perovitz was another, worked together to try to organize an effort to simply take over the mills and put them in the hands of the workers. A lot of popular support for that in the working class and the community. Well, ultimately, it failed. Turns out very often the financial managers who run these things are unwilling even to do something profitable if it provides the conception and idea that workers can take over plants and run enterprises and run them for themselves. Not a good idea to put in people's minds. You're supposed to believe that the optimal world is one in which you spend your life, most of your working life, as a serf slave taking orders from a master. It's called the job contract. That's the ideal in life, is to enter into the job contract and devote your working life, your waking hours to following orders. It's very important to instill that conception in people's minds, because if they begin to think otherwise, they may realize that we don't need any bosses. One of Mike Alford's books, in fact, is called No Bosses. Why should we accept this? It's not a very novel idea. It goes back to the early Industrial Revolution. In fact, the idea was considered so obvious in the late 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution was developing, so obvious it was even a slogan of the Republican Party under Lincoln, that what was commonly called wage slavery is intolerable. Working people felt, and the then Republican Party agreed that it was a fundamental attack on human rights and human dignity to be compelled to submit yourself to a master for, in fact, most of your waking life. The great Knights of Labor, the first great labor movement, was based on the idea, as they put it, that those who work in the mills should own them, run them, and manage them. The famous factory girls, young women, driven from the farms to work in the mills, had a very extensive, they ran their own newspapers, publications, extensive material there with the same ideas being generated and produced. Philip Foner, great labor historian, edited many of these. These were very common ideas in the late 19th century. And it's been very important to drive them out of people's minds, to make sure you can't have such conceptions. This comes up over and over again through history. One time was a very important moment at the end of the First World War, when there was a lot of a wave of radical democracy. People wanted a different world than the one that had been constructed. They had learned during the war that private enterprise is not even an efficient way to run an economy. To run an efficient economy, the state took it over. And that turned out to be a far more effective way of producing the economy that could fight the war than private enterprise. Same thing happened in the Second World War, the same consequences, a realization that these ideas that you must subject yourself to a master are necessary for efficient life. And there was, at the end of the First World War, a wave of radical democracy mostly in Europe. In the United States, it was beaten down by vicious repression. The famous Red Scare, mostly anti-labor, and devastated the vibrant Socialist Party, the labor movements, deported hundreds of activists, anarchists, Emma Goldman and others, established a legacy in the United States, which has been hard to break up until today. Europe even more so. Strong measures were taken to counter it. In some countries, fascism, Italy, later Germany, other countries, basically austerity programs. There's a great book that just appeared on this, if you want to learn more about it, by Clara Mattei, discusses the manner in which these waves were put down. They keep coming up and they have to be put down. Well, going back to Youngstown, the idea that working people should take over the enterprise themselves is offensive to the capitalist owners for pretty good reasons. They don't want such concepts to spread. Didn't work. Well, they didn't give up. What they did was try to form working class enterprises, worker-owned enterprises that would fit into the kind of economy that was developing out of the collapse of the industrial economy. So worker-owned laundry services for hospitals and other enterprises that were developing in the Cleveland area. This has now spread fairly substantially. There are many such examples, and networks have developed. That's one concrete way to respond to the crisis imposed by the neoliberal assault on the population. Cooperatives, thousands of cooperatives are another form. Same is happening in other countries. Take Brazil, our counterpart in South America in many ways. The largest popular movement in the world happens to be in Brazil, is the MST, the landless workers movement. Began with landless workers just taking over unused agricultural areas owned by the billionaires, corporations, foreigners, and just settling on them, resisting the efforts of the state, of the security forces of the state to expel them. It's now developed extensively. They've moved on to creating small enterprises like growing out of agriculture, like dairy enterprises that fit into the surrounding economy, provide dairy products and so on. This is developing quite extensively. And there are other similar things throughout the world. We can find many of them. Well, all of these are concrete ways to create the seeds of the future in the present society. And that extends, as was mentioned in the introduction, but to things like, say, the Columbia Workers, a student unionization program. How does that fit in? By breaking the conception, which is at the heart of the neoliberal assault, that we have to be alone, isolated, atomized, facing the market ravages alone without defense. Notice that one of the first acts of Thatcher and Reagan, when the neoliberal programs was instituted, first act was to attack unions, the standard means of defense of working people against capitalist assault. So it's very important to break them, to break down the idea that you can work cooperatively to produce conditions, proper conditions for your own future. You have to be isolated, atomized, separated from one another. Well, unions in the past, can remember this from childhood in New York, were not just organizations to protect wages. They were a way of life. Unions involved cultural activities, educational activities. My own family mostly lived in New York, extended family, unemployed, first generation immigrants. My aunts were unemployed seamstresses. They had quite a rich life through the union, ILGU, International Ladies Garment Worker Union, which had cultural programs, educational programs, even a week up in the Catskills. It was a whole rich life. Now, that's what unions were in the past. One of their major principles was that education should be available to everyone throughout life. So adult education programs were a core part of the existing unions. Radical intellectuals often participated, people like J.D. Bernal, others engaged in radical education programs. All of that has to be broken. It's necessary for people to be alone. It's been more effective in the United States than in other countries. I see it constantly, just my own experience. So if I give a talk in Australia, Canada, England, continent, can often be at a union hall, not here, because they've been so successfully crushed and demolished that these things don't exist. Going back to the union efforts at Columbia, Starbucks, and elsewhere, begins to rebuild that kind of consciousness. It leads to the background from which constructive activities can be undertaken to build the kinds of society we should hope to have, in which those who produce are in control of their own production and their productive lives, make democratic decisions democratically as to how the enterprise should function, work in conjunction with democratically run communities. They, of course, interact deeply integrated with one another, same people, in fact, just in different functions in life. And out of that develop a cooperative society, democratically run, eliminating illegitimate hierarchies and domination. Then we're on to moving towards something that could be a realistic approach to utopia. My own feeling is if such processes can proceed, as I think they should, they'll meet many obstacles, of course, we will find along the way problems that we didn't envision. Social progress is kind of like mountain climbing. You see a peak of a hill, you work hard, you get to the peak, and you discover it's not the peak. There's another one farther behind that you didn't know about. Then you climb that one. That's what social progress has been like. Things that you didn't even perceive and comprehend come into vision when you make certain achievements. So I think there's a lot to learn, a lot of prospect for progress if we can manage to escape the crises, existential crises that are imminent and may, in fact, terminate the human experiment before there's any chance to proceed with this. And that's not an exaggeration. I would urge anyone who is not aware of it to pay close attention to the announcement on January 24th of how the hands of the doomsday clock are being set. You know what that is, I'm sure. Established by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists shortly after the bombing of Hiroshima. The hands of the clock are set a certain distance from midnight, where midnight essentially means termination. Originally set at 7 minutes to midnight, oscillated over the years, depending on assessments of the global situation. During the Trump years, it was the analysts abandoned minutes, moved to seconds. It's now set at 100 seconds to midnight. On January 24th, the second hand will probably be moved closer to midnight, certainly should be, since all of the fundamental problems have been exacerbated during the past year. Well, there are feasible methods to overcome these crises. They're known, requires will, determination, energy. And if they can be overcome, the prospects are open to develop concrete utopias, which will carry us forward on the long effort over human history to try to create a livable and more viable world. Stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. I thought it was really profound and powerful to think about unions, as you said, as a way of life and the kind of sites of study and culture and the presence, how that time period before now, like the sense of collaboration and cooperativity that was functioning there, that maybe is different now. And you talked about the theme of austerity and the neoliberal assault on ways of life. And you mentioned union several times at Columbia. And I wanted to ask, I know in '67, you wrote your now classic essay on the responsibility of intellectuals. And given the state of the university now, in terms of the kind of neoliberal university model, I'm wondering if you can speak to how those responsibilities might have changed and what might the role of the intellectual be today, given these conditions?
Well, I think the role is the same, and it goes back through history. You can trace it back to classical Greece and the biblical period. As far as, so take classical Greece, there was someone, as you know, who was forced to commit suicide because he was carrying out a dangerous crime. He was asking too many questions. He was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking them to think about things that were not conducive to sustaining power and domination. At the same time, roughly the same era, in the biblical record, the oral traditions that became the Bible, there were people who were called prophets. Prophet is a dubious translation of an obscure Hebrew word. They were basically what we would call dissenting intellectuals, people giving a critique of the power and the exercise of power by the brutal kings, calling for mercy for widows and orphans, calling for an honest, more decent life. They were treated very poorly, imprisoned, driven into the desert, and so on. That's a pattern that goes right through history. Different varies depending on the nature of the society. The responsibility of intellectuals has always been to take that dedication to truth, justice, mercy as guiding values. And that always means struggling against existing power structures. Now, as for the responsibility of intellectuals today as compared with 50 years ago, same responsibility, different institutional structures. To take the universities, they have changed in a number of ways. One way they've changed is that they've come more open, free, inquiring, deliberative. That's been one of the civilizing effects of the student activism of the 1960s and their aftermath, which broke through a lot of the dominant conventions that controlled and suppressed students and others. A lot of that is gone. There's a reaction. The reaction is to undermine the universities and the schools. So over the past 50 years, there are major efforts on the part of private power, the state authorities, which they dominate, simply to eliminate or undermine the institutions that I'll quote what should be a famous statement: the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. Got to undermine those institutions are not doing their job, and either they have to become more forceful in indoctrinating the young, or else just defunded and undermined. I'm quoting from very important book. I urge you to read it. It's called The Crisis of Democracy. It's the first publication of the Trilateral Commission, 1975. It's trilateral because it was liberal intellectuals of the Europe, Japan, and the United States, three major centers of contemporary democratic state capitalism. You can get the political tenor of it from the fact that the Carter administration was drawn almost entirely from their ranks. So Carter-style liberal Democrats. I was quoting from the American rapporteur, spokesperson for this conference, Samuel Huntington, professor of the science of government at Harvard University, well-known liberal intellectual. He was concerned, as he put it, that the universities were not performing their proper function of indoctrination of the young. That's why you see young people out in the streets protesting the Vietnam War, calling for women's rights, calling for civil rights, supporting the civil rights movement, moving on to environmental concerns. We don't want all of that. Students are supposed to be passive, obedient, doing their job like other people, not causing problems. The general conclusion of the Trilateral Commission is that the crisis of democracy is there's too much democracy. People who are supposed to be passive and obedient are breaking out and calling for their rights. People who are called special interests, like young people, old people, women, working people, farmers, in other words, the general population. They didn't mention it, but there's another group that is not to be touched. They represent the national interest, the ownership class, the rich, the privileged, the corporate sector. That's the national interest, so we don't touch them. But the special interests have to have more moderation and democracy. Go home and be quiet. That was the liberal end of the spectrum. At the harsher end, it was just plain defunding. Universities, state universities have been severely defunded. Schools have been defunded. The neoliberal gurus like Milton Friedman thought you should just get rid of the public school system entirely. Why should we have that interference with markets like a public school system? And it has been carried out to a significant extent in several ways. At the right, like the Trump administration, the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, was committed to the idea that the public schools ought to be eliminated. Why should we have that? You should just have private education, religious education, and so on. And the policies were designed for that. You go to the other end. Obama, Arne Duncan, directed education. They had a different way of undermining education, namely what's called teaching to test. Let's set up an educational system in which students are trained to answer questions on a general exam, which will be monitored, and you get all the metrics. You can rank every school and every teacher by how well it's working. This is the absolute worst form of education. John Dewey spent most of his life opposing it and calling for a kind of education which would instill and encourage the natural creativity and inquisitiveness of students, get them to work on their own and together collaboratively to develop their minds and their intellects and their interests. Back in the 18th century, the Obama-Duncan approach was ridiculed as being like pouring water into a vessel and then having it come out in little bits called taking a test. Now, I'm sure you've all had experiences where you had to take a course that you had no interest in. You studied for the exam, got an A, a couple weeks later forgot what the course was about. That's teaching to test. Worst possible, one way of undermining the educational system. The other way is brute force, just defund it. Colleges don't have tenured professors, use adjuncts who get paid practically nothing, or graduate students, cheap, easily exploitable labor. Well, the unionization efforts are an attempt to block that. So what's the responsibility of intellectuals? Always the same. Find structures of power that are illegitimate, undermine them in your scholarship, in your activism. Work with others, bring the message as best you can to others, help them come to understand it. That's the responsibility of intellectuals. The task changes as the institutions change.
Thank you so much, Noam Chomsky, for that, and for so directly addressing kind of the topic and the concerns that we are addressing here in Utopia 1313. I really appreciate it. I want to touch on. I had originally suggested I would touch on the distinction between the better and the best, which was something that I felt very much in our emails back and forth. And before this seminar, I had a sense that you had some hesitation. I also saw it, of course, in the famous Chomsky-Foucault debate, some hesitations with notions of the best, of course. And as I hear you today and read you, I understand some of the hesitations, and the mountain climbing a metaphor is, of course, perfect, right? The hill that looks as if you're going to climb to the top of the mountain, and then once you get there, you just see that you got another 2,000 meters to go because it was hidden by that mountain itself. And I also heard at the beginning, though, that you were talking about being somewhat skeptical about knowing enough about what would work successfully. So there are elements of, in part, there are elements of the fact that our objectives change once we get there. Also, notions of fallibility. Also, this idea that we can't be sure of what of how we will act and think once we have broken the fetters of oppression. So there are lots of elements that lead to humility. And I think that that's where your preference for notions of the better comes from. Epistemic humility, in a way, and the impossibility of really knowing and what will be out there in the future. Now, in part, I think that is what we are trying to do here, in a way, not talking about totalizing utopias, but instead talking about concrete utopias that are achievable or have been achieved, and that at some point we'll have to overcome, knowing that, even as we have achieved this, there's more to do. And in a way, I think your presentation today embraces that notion of concrete utopias in a more limited sense, of existing possibilities, existing things that have been achieved that can give us inspiration to continue and to fight more for social transformation. So I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of consonance between your vision and the one that we are developing, at least, and presenting in this seminar, which led me in the last post I just sent you, which just went up, so you probably haven't had the chance to see it, to actually ending up trying to suggest that ultimately, for Noam Chomsky, the common good is a form of anarcho-syndicalism that includes both dismantling of unjustified forms of power and the reconstruction of a society based on cooperation. And here, I think the passage that you use twice in your Dewey lectures, I think captures best Noam Chomsky. So I'm going to read it and then ask you if I missed the target or if I got it. And it's this passage from Rudolf Rocker, right? And their reconstructive project, which was, quote, an alliance of free groups of men and women based on cooperative labor and a planned administration of things in the interests of the community. Would that capture pretty well where you are and have been for some years in terms of these questions of social change?
Yes, captures it perfectly. Not just for some years, but quite a few years, since I was about 12 years old, wandering up and down 4th Avenue and the anarchist bookstores and the offices in Union Square. And that's where I picked up Rudolf Rocker, got a lot of my political education from him, and also from participants like the Spanish emigres who fled after the Franco takeover. But yes, that's captures exactly what has been an inspiring idea for me all of my life, never gone away. And I think the more I think about it, the older I get, the more appropriate it seems. And I think the distinction you make between dismantling and reconstructing is a very significant one. These are two complementary tasks. They should interact. We should dismantle oppressive structures, create cooperative, forward-looking ones at the same time, two kinds of action that reinforce one another. They're mutually supportive actions. And we even learn about each from performing the other. From the act of constructing, we learn more about what should be dismantled and how to do it.
Thank you so much. Jay, you wanted to ask a question on anarchism, or does it? Yeah. So we've got one question coming in from Neni Penurgia on Zoom. And so if we could highlight Neni and welcome Neni to our space. And then also I see Sonia, Hope. So why don't we do three and then back to you, Noam, if that's okay. We'll do Neni and then Sonia and then Hope. Okay. All right, Neni, go for it. And welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Chomsky. It's a great pleasure to see you. I've been reading you ever since I was a graduate student in 1981, and I was very touched by everything that you said, the way that you brought together the question of education with the question of capitalism, something, of course, that you have been thinking about and writing about and telling us about all these years. I wish I could share your optimism, but especially today, which I feel is a really black day for Colombia, because we just got a new president who was in the upper rungs of the IMF and the World Bank, not an intellectual, a person who was deeply involved in crushing the economies of Ireland, Spain, Greece, Portugal, and Italy during the financial crisis in the 2012, right? On this day, I am wondering how optimistic can we still be on what you have talked about and written about, and Edward Said has also written about, not only the responsibility of the intellectual, but also primarily as the university being the last utopian space, right? So I am just wondering if the precipitation of the collusion between capital, naked cannibalistic capitalism in governance of the universities in the United States is not much faster than we might have thought, or has not been arrested as a development by the movements, the social movements that have come over the decades.
Thank you, Nini.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nini.
Sure.
Great. And thanks for bringing Columbia back into the conversation. We're going to take two more questions, if that's okay with you, Noam, and then allow you to respond. Sonia Anwar.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Chomsky. This is truly an honor. Same, I've been reading your work in Pakistan, actually, so where I was born and raised. So a long distance reader. And my question focuses a little bit more on that skepticism that you had referred to earlier. And I'm wondering if there's another layer to that epistemic humility, and that is the skepticism in itself of power. Would you associate the temporal characteristics of utopia, the future itself being a source of power or as an asset of the powerful? And I'm wondering if there's a way to distinguish the idea of the ideal and the better as future as a noun and future as a verb. And in that, I'm specifically thinking about reclamation efforts that arise out of radical movements such as Afrofuturism, or even union building as we see it now. So is that the distinction where the ideal is less about the ideal as a noun and more about the ideality, which is always the part of pushing for the better? And so is concretizing utopia less about that calcified vision and more about this perpetual dynamic utopia?
Thank you, Sonia. And we're going to have one more, Hope Schinderman.
Hi, thank you. I first want to say thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. It is truly a wonderful honor and experience that I'm so happy to be a part of. So I have a question about labor and about life that cannot labor or labors in a way that differs from common conceptions. And when I think of this, I'm specifically thinking about disabled life, which includes myself. And I was wondering, then, does labor not become an oppressive structure that separates the able from the disabled, and how this kind of separation can be resisted through human organization and human relations? So I guess how can labor, how can organizing, forming coalitions, unionizing, etc., be used to foster an understanding of life that includes those who currently aren't completely acknowledged as beings?
Thank you so much, Hope. So those are three questions that kind of push in slightly different directions, or at least Do you want to go ahead, Noam?
Well, these are very probing questions which raise many issues. To start with, I might say that the problems that have been raised take a particular form, and often a stark form in the United States, but they're much broader. Mentioning the IMF brings that up. It's take England, the first of the two modern democracies, first England and the United States. In England, there has also been a serious attack on the university system. The Tory government even went to the extent of arguing that departments should justify themselves by their ability to sell themselves on the market. So the classics department, if it wants to support at Oxford, wants to support itself, should show that it is responsive to market pressures. One educational analyst, Stephen Collini, wrote an article, I think, in the Times Literary Supplement, in which he said the Tory government is trying to turn first-class universities into third-class commercial enterprises. That's also, to some extent, true in the United States. Back in 1981, early days of the neoliberal assault, an amendment was passed in Congress, Birch-Bayh Amendment, which gave universities the right to patent discoveries that were made in university laboratories. That's a move towards turning science and scholarship into commercial enterprises. It has a very cheapening effect on the universities, on the community, on the mentality of participants. You become interested in making money, not in making discoveries for the common good. And it's one of many such effects of trying to turn people into atoms of production and consumption, looking for themselves, not working for the general good. That's been a common feature of the neoliberal programs. The IMF has in fact implemented them in ways which have been extremely destructive to many societies which have been forced to accept structural adjustment programs which undermined working conditions, benefits, popular organization, led to decades, literally, of stagnation and underdevelopment, with very harmful effects. I should say this is part of the austerity programs that were initiated at the end of the First World War in an effort to beat back popular activism organization, efforts to create radical alternatives to capitalist oppression. It's been going on for a century. This book that I mentioned by Clara Mate is a very good analysis and review of these programs up to the present. Well, that brings us to the notions of, I think the phrase that was used was dynamic utopia. We're in a constant process of trying to discover what we're trying to achieve while taking steps towards building it and achieving it. And that should, as I said, it's an interactive process. My own feeling is I do share the kind of skepticism that was mentioned. I think there's an awful lot that we just don't know and understand about human beings, about their capacities, their cognitive capacities. I think we've been learning more over time. There's if you look over history, the kinds of things that were accepted as normal and so obvious you don't even mention them not many years ago are now considered unthinkable, unspeakable. Not that many years. I mean, you go back to the 17th and 18th century and take a look at what's considered appropriate behavior, way of behaving towards people who violated norms, questioned authority, and so on. It's so unspeakable you can barely discuss it. But we don't have to go back that far. Go back, say, to the 1960s, before the mostly student-inspired activism had a civilizing effect on the whole society. It's worth looking back to see how much progress has been made in simply understanding and sense of sensibility. The 1960s, the United States still had anti-miscegenation laws, which were so extreme that the Nazis refused to accept them. Anti-sodomy laws, of course. Federal law imposed segregation on public housing, blocked Afro-Americans from entering into the large-scale public housing projects that were developed in the 50s and the 60s. Big effect. Wealth in the United States for most people is property. Property is mostly what the home that you live in. That meant that during the great development period of the 50s and the 60s, maybe for the first time, a Black man could get a decent job in the auto industry, couldn't buy a house, couldn't get the basis for economic progress and participation in the broader community. It's left a tremendous legacy. That was the 1950s. In the 1950s, women, half the population, were still not considered persons. They were considered property. That's English common law. It's the founders established the country that way. A woman is property of her father, property is handed over to the husband. That was actually on the books until 1975, when for the first time the Supreme Court determined that women are peers, have a guaranteed right to serve in federal trials, which means they're no longer quasi-persons. Well, virtually very little in the way of anti-militarism, opposition to aggression and violence. Took years to try to develop an active movement against the Vietnam War, one of the most horrible crimes since the Second World War. Well, a lot of that has changed. There's plenty that's wrong, and there's been a reaction. The reaction has been to try to control and enforce better indoctrination of the young by various means. Talked about them before. It's a constant struggle. So, and during the struggle, there is progress. There are steps that have been made that give us a basis to build for a better future. There are new and hard and harsh problems that arise along the way. That struggle is never going to end as long as human society exists. We will find, after some victories, we'll find new problems. We can take, we can respect those who have worked and struggled to create the progress that has been made, and recognize that the best we can do is stand on their shoulders, walk in their footprints, see what we can achieve for the future.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. You've been very generous with your time, and we are deeply grateful that you have participated and presented, both I and Che. And I'm extraordinarily thankful to Che for organizing this. Do you want to say?
Oh, no, just second that emotion. Thank you so much.
So first, we all want to thank you for joining the seminar.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be with you. Glad to know about what you're doing.
You have a room full of people who have come to me saying, oh, I've been reading Noam Chomsky since I was a little kid, and I just can't believe he's going to be here. So we are thrilled and deeply grateful to you, Che. And just want to tell everyone that we'll be meeting next on February 1st, and we'll be discussing the new book, Concrete Utopianism by Gary Wilder. We'll have Fred Moten here, as well as Gary Wilder, of course, Nadia Abu El-Haj, and Kayama Glover talking about that new work. I should say that Professor Chomsky, you mentioned a few times Clara Mattei's book, her new book, which has just appeared, The Capital Order. And we've been in touch with Clara also, and we're going to be bringing her in here and having a conversation about her new book as well. So that's perfect symbiosis. Thank you for that. And then after that, on February 8th, we're just going to go quickly. We've got Cornell West coming in with Derica Purnell and Amna Akbar to talk about the role of law in progressive politics. So we hope you'll join us for those. They come kind of back to back, unusual. Usually we've got a little bit more separation, but we've had a wonderful response. So thank you so much, Noam Chomsky.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you.